Hello, welcome to the last video I'm doing on Dominaria United. Probably, I would suggest. Seems pretty likely that's going to be the case. Brothers Word is coming out pretty soon. And one of the things about this format that has been so unique and interesting and has made it for such a good format to play is the metagame in the format has evolved considerably from where it started. And this is true and for a number of reasons, and has done so through a number of decks. Like, it never sort of like swings back, right? The pendulum never sort of swings back and says, all right, well, this deck was good at the beginning, and then people overdraft it, and then it goes back at the end or whatever. But this isn't like that. This format wasn't really like that. It's sort of very unique in the way that it evolved meta-wise. So I'm today going to talk a little bit about that. What decks were good in the format, probably still are good in the format if you come back and you haven't done it before or whatever, just for future reference. So we're going to start a little bit with the history of Dominaria United. Without further ado, let's begin with the preset hype. The preset hype is always interesting. This format actually had more preset hype than I remember there being for a lot of other formats in terms of like one deck people thought was going to be really good, and that deck was Izzet, right? So people saw the Izzet cards, the spells, themes, and said, okay, these uncommons are really strong. Specifically the two on the screen here, Electrostatic Infantry and Balmor. And people sort of thought, all right, this is like all the other formats in history. Two-color decks are going to be the best thing to be doing, and so therefore Izzet's going to be the best thing to be doing because it looks like the best two-color deck. Not only was Izzet not the best two-color deck, it wasn't even really a top-tier deck in general. At least on average. There were some, of course, you're always going to have some outlier scenarios with rare cards and whatever that can make it so that your deck is a top-tier deck just by card quality, but overall, it wasn't quite as strong as people thought it was going to be before the set released. There are a number of reasons for this. I think the first is that removal was good in this format, and there was a lot of good removal in the format. So there was this problem you would run into with Izzet where you're like, well, I need them to not remove my 2-drop, and it's turn 6, and they're at 4 life, and I need them to not have any more removal, and then they just have it, and you lose. Or they play a green 4-mana 4/4, and you're like, well, I kind of can't beat that because it sort of blocks all my stuff, and they've stabilized a little bit. And that was kind of it. That's the deck. The deck is you get your opponent to 4 life, and then it's kind of a coin flip, usually, at that point. The format sort of was just strong enough to kind of keep this thing from being as strong as people thought. I think that it was very close. I think that in most formats that have existed in history, this would have been the strongest archetype. I don't think it would really have been especially close. I think that the assessment in the pre-release was actually kind of right, that this deck most of the time is the best deck, and it is oppressive and a problem because Balmor is so good. Now, Electrostatic Infantry kind of underperformed my expectations. I expected it to be a very good card. A lot of people expected it to be a very good card. It basically has prowess, except it just keeps the counter. I think Talarian Geyser and Destroy Evil kind of destroyed this card, because if you bounce it, it basically is useless. It just is a 2-mana 1/2 again. And then if you have Destroy Evil, it's so cheap to remove it once it gets stronger, and you've put resources into making it stronger, and maybe you haven't used your spells as efficiently as you could because you're getting the value on this card, so you don't have to do that. So then you kind of just get a little bit blown out at that stage, right? You've undervalued your spells because you thought you were getting that back with electrostatic infantry, and then it gets wiped out by a very cheap removal spell. This deck also, at times, had a difficult balance between creatures and spells. You do need creatures for your Balmor to hit your opponent, but you do also need the cheap spells. The deck sort of becomes a lot of air. The deck is mostly air. It's all draw spells and cantrips and whatever. They're the same thing, so true. But at the end of the day, it didn't have enough to consistently be a strong deck. Of course, there are strong builds of it, and when you have the Balmor combo, whatever going, it's busted. You kill your opponent for 35, and they're just dead in one turn. But that dream was not really ever realized. Now, once we actually got into the format and started playing with it, people found out pretty quickly that the best deck in the format is Defenders. This is still true, although it is less true than it was at the start of the format because people know how to draft properly now. Part of the reason that Defenders was so strong is that nobody ever picked Chaplain. The card would wheel in pack 1 frequently, so it once people figured out that the card was insane, it propagated through, and it actually became not that big of a deal by the end of the format. Of course, if you still have it in your deck, it's still really good. It's still the best uncommon ever, probably. And the reason behind that is, of course, the card to its top left, Shield Wall Sentinel, that tutors it up. And I've called these 3 defenders the Triumvirate here. Walking Bulwark is, of course, the lowest ranking member of the Triumvirate, but it's still really, really good. It's still really good. I actually think you can just play Walking Bulwark, not stand alone. But if you have a couple of defenders, you would want Walking Bulwark in your deck, it is pretty decent. It does make your 0-5s into 5-5s, and that is actually pretty meaningful. Haste also is a keyword on the card, believe it or not. There's not much to say. This is the first time in Earth's history a Defender deck has really been viable and limited, and it is likely to be the last time, but I'm glad I was here. I'm happy to have been here for the rise of the Defenders. Part of the reason this deck was so good is that the format didn't... the aggressive decks on the format actually match up fairly poorly against the Defenders for the most part. The Defenders tend to be overstated and only care about playing defense, so the aggro red-white decks sort of are I was hoping that you'd be playing some tap lands, and the Defender decks often are multicolored, but I think the best Defender deck actually is the Esper Defenders, and then you have green for repossession splashing and stuff like that, or some grottos for that. But yeah, basically you're jamming Chaplain in any deck you could fit it in for the most part. You really didn't need to have that many defenders. You needed 5 if one of them was a Shield Wall Sentinel, and you're just yep, it's going into the deck, because it's even the threat of its existence is enough for it to be valuable as a card. So I've said enough. It was the best deck early on. In response to this, the meta continued, and people sort of found that the best color in the format was blue. There are divergent schools of thought on what the quote-unquote best color in the format is. I think that you kind of have to think about it in a sense where, yes, the white cards are probably the best standalone cards, right? Your white package sort of plays the best together. You have the right sort of balance between payoff and whatever, enabler. But I think that the more common case is that you are playing a deck with multiple colors. And so, because, in my opinion, blue pairs best with every color, pretty much, it is it's the best color, right? Red-blue is the best red deck. Blue-green is maybe the best green deck, although, I don't know, maybe red-green domain you could make the argument is better. Maybe green-black domain. They're all kind of the same deck with green, so it's a little hard to distinguish. Blue-white, I believe, is the best white deck, except for maybe Boros. But I don't know, blue-white is real good. Again, it's kind of hard with this format because you're never really playing two colors. And when you are, you're playing aggro. So, yeah, I mean, the blue package really just worked well together. I'll talk about why I believe that this era was basically defined as, well, all the blue cards are available, so you can just get 3 Tolarian Terrors in your deck and a bunch of these other cards that are all pretty interchangeable. And the Terrors will cost like 2 mana on turn 7, and then you're just playing 2 of them, and your opponent can't win, basically, ever. Another advantage that blue has here is that as the counterspell color in Modern, limited, all of the best cards do stuff when they enter the battlefield, and so you have the luxury of being able to prevent that from happening, as opposed to having to deal with them after. So you can counter the Archangel of Wraths or other stuff that is going to hit you in the face a lot, and prevent that from being a problem. So yeah, blue I believe is the best place to be if you can get the Tolarian Terrors enabled. They're some of the best cards in the format. This is a tough moment for data with the Tolarian Terrors because people do play them in decks that shouldn't have them, or not even that shouldn't have them, but where they're not as good. Like maybe they have to play them, but they're not maximized, and it's really a difficult format to handicap from a like, hey, this card is always good all the time. And that's just not true in this format really ever. So it's part of the reason it's very interesting. Yeah, so this era was sort of like people knew about the Defenders, and people were like, the next thing was like, oh, blue is so good in the package, and especially blue-black. This is one of the best standalone like control decks that we've seen in a long time, and it really just does the whole 9 yards, right? It really did the whole control elements. You could do, you could wait 5 turns playing removal spells on your opponent's creatures and then play a Tolarian Terror, and it's like, well, I guess the game's just over. Next, Domain. People learned early on that Domain was good, but as people started to draft the blue cards highly, it really became the place to be in the format. Lands were still somewhat available, and you could find other fixing if you had to. All of the best cards in the format were at your fingertips here. You could play whatever you wanted. Personal pet card of mine, Maria's Outrider. It's just a good card, but also one of my favorites in the set. Love playing the card. I love recurring the card, and it just is really something to behold, as it were. You essentially, and Sirkovitz has talked about this on his show, and also Limited Resources. If you haven't seen it, those are the big guns from a content perspective. But they talked about how playing multicolor in this format doesn't actually impact your win rate negatively like it usually does, because you actually are getting back the equity you're giving up by losing games due to having poor fixing. By having more powerful cards, the power level is actually making up for it, which has not historically been true pretty much ever. It's very difficult to find a situation where that's the case, and this is primarily due to the fact that the lands you can get lands. Because they're not in the land slot, and because they're in a common slot, you can actually get them, because there's one person can't just sit there and be like, all right, I'm taking every single land, all of the lands in pack 1. And you can't do that, because sometimes there's 3 lands in a pack, and sometimes there's no lands in a pack. And you can't take all the lands, and so people are actually more likely to have them, and they're more likely to be available to you. It's harder to cut it off, which honestly I really like. I think that was a really good choice to not have the tap lands in a land slot and instead have them in a common spot. So that was a thumbs up decision for me. And now sort of like into the next era, this sort of like is where the format kind of branches, where it sort of is a play style dependent. I tend to be an aggro player, but this format I was not. I very much wasn't an aggro player. I had a couple of aggro decks. Like my second deck in the format was like a black-white aggro deck, and that was kind of it. And I just started playing like domain shenanigans, Esper control stuff. Esper Control, at its peak, was, I believe, the best deck in the format. It just had everything, because divinations are wheeling, and divinations are good. Like, the Phyrexian and Espionage wheeling in, like, every single pack it's in basically made this type of deck unstoppable. You really just didn't ever have a chance if the opponent had enough removal to get rid of your stuff. They had counter spells. Protect the Negotiators was just it's just an insane card. It's just really good. It does all the stuff you want. I don't know when people are going to learn that counter spells that make something on the board are insane and just like really good. It doesn't matter like whether or not they work 100% of the time. They're just so good when they work that it doesn't matter. And Protect the Negotiators being able to counter anything really did matter, because there were good sagas and stuff in the format to counter. Destroy Evil. Destroy Evil is an interesting card because its mana cost almost, like it does matter that it's 2 mana, but also like it's such an enormous, it's always a blowout when you cast it, because things that have toughness 4 or greater are more expensive generally, and enchantments also tend to be more expensive. So you're kind of getting a tempo blowout. No matter if you cast the cards, it's just a blowout every single time. Now, obviously, it sits in your hand sometimes, not very often in this format. It's just a really good card. And then Tribute to Urborg, a very, very good removal spell that kills pretty much anything, because you're playing so many spells in your deck to enable your Tolarian Terrors and your other stuff. This was just really fun. I loved playing this deck. It was very fun. It's not open anymore, at least not on Arena. But in the future, when we come back, I'm sure it will be open again. We can all have fun drafting it. And then sort of like where we're at currently, we've sort of reached a bit of stability, I think, at this point. You can kind of draft whatever you want. I think that everything is pretty balanced. We've reached a place where it's like, yeah, people know what's good, so they're not going to let you just have the best deck every time. Domain isn't always open, but when it is, you can still draft it. Like hardcore domain, I'm talking like whatever. I usually end up in some sort of weird domain, sort of 3-color, 4-color thing. Pretty much is my usual drafts. And this is centered around the Urborg Repossession. One of the best cards in the format. Just no stop, right? And a true advocate for you have to be able to kick it card. You basically, the amount of times I've cast this unkicked is very low, and you only do it when you're either about to win the game and the only way you lose is you get burned out, or you're about to lose the game, and for the same reason you're like, I don't want to get burned out, so I'm casting this to get one thing back. But you almost always have enough time to get 2 things back. And it just is just great. The card's just great. You sort of end up in these grindy matchups where you have to be able to outgrind your opponent, and this card does that. Vohar is another card that works really well with it, despite forcing you to be in 3 colors. It doesn't matter. You can just do that in this format. You just are 3 colors all the time. And that's sort of where we landed. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention why I think the format is good and the domainy decks didn't really get out of control. Is these aggro decks are present. You have your domain aggro, your Boros aggro, and these decks, when built properly, are extremely strong and extremely fast, especially with your Neshoba Brawler. Like Neshoba Brawler it's a 2-drop that can have the stats of a 5-drop on turn 3. It's insanity, right? It's a trample. It really does push damage early. When your opponent plays it on 2, you're behind. You're just you're in for a world of hurt if you don't get rid of it. I have had the privilege of going Neshoba Brawler into Neshoba Brawler. I would recommend that. That's a big plus. I believe I won that game. Yeah, that was solid. And very interesting. The thing about the red-green domain aggro deck is it's very complex to draft it properly because you have to you want to have these off-color dual lands to power up your cards, but you also don't want to play tap lands because you're an aggro deck. So you kind of just want random off-color duels. You don't really want on-color duels. So that's the deck, and it's very fun. And Boros was just a consistent 2-color aggro deck. There's really not anything interesting to say about it. For the most part, it was just good. There was just tokens were good. Enlist was solid, but not overpowered. I think the mechanic was a win, actually. I think it did what it was supposed to do, which is make combat a little more interesting without basically making aggro extremely dominant. And that's it. So there was balance kept in the format by the aggressive decks and the controlling decks, and this is sort of why the format is so great. Part of the reason the format is so great is there's so many things you can do, yeah, it really had a complex life cycle in terms of what decks were the best at any time. And honestly, I think if it were to continue to exist, if it were continue to be the main feature format, I think it's possible that there would be more evolutions in the meta. That's how deep the format really is. So thanks for sticking around. Hope this was informative or enlightening in some way. I enjoy talking about this kind of stuff. Hopefully I'll be doing some Brothers War things. I got to get my act together on that. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, that's it. So see you next time.